Hey everyone, welcome back. Tonight, we are going somewhere filthy, chaotic, and surprisingly familiar. We are dropping you into the middle of the greatest city the ancient world ever produced, and we are going to show you exactly what it looked like from the ground up. Not from the marble steps of the Senate, not from the gilded dining rooms of the aristocracy, but from the cracked cobblestones beneath ordinary feet. We're talking about ancient Rome. Not the Rome of history documentaries with their soaring CGI temples and toga-draped heroes debating philosophy in sunlit courtyards. The real Rome. The loud, overcrowded, disease-riddled, smoke-choked, gloriously chaotic Rome that most people actually lived in. Before we dive in, if you enjoy this kind of deep, unfiltered journey into history, go ahead and hit that like button, subscribe if you're new, and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I always love knowing who's up late with me across the world. Now, settle in. Maybe pour something warm. Turn the lights down just a little. Because tonight we are going back nearly 2,000 years to a city of 1 million people crammed into a space the size of a modern suburb where the food was questionable, the streets were dangerous, the plumbing was revolutionary and also terrifying, and where life was loud, short, and completely unlike anything Hollywood has ever shown you. Let's go. Congratulations. You have just woken up in Rome. The year is approximately 100 AD, during the reign of the Emperor Trajan, a man history will later call one of the best emperors Rome ever had, though you personally have never seen him and probably never will. What you have seen is the inside of your insula apartment, which is where we find you now, blinking awake in the gray pre-dawn light. First, let's talk about where you are sleeping. Your home is an insula, a Roman apartment building, and it is not the kind of place that would get good reviews on any modern platform. Insulae were the dominant housing structure for most of Rome's urban population. They were tall, usually 4 to 7 stories high, built from a combination of timber framing and fired brick, and they were stacked so closely together that neighbors on opposite buildings could practically shake hands through their windows. Your particular apartment is somewhere on the upper floors. Ground floor units go to the wealthier residents or to shops, because being close to the street is actually a privilege. The higher you live, the cheaper your rent and the further you are from the nearest water source, the communal latrine, and any hope of a quick escape if things go badly. And things go badly quite often. You are sleeping on a narrow wooden bed frame with a stuffed mattress. If you are among the fortunate, that stuffing is wool or straw. If you are among the less fortunate, and statistically most people are, the stuffing is whatever was available, possibly dried leaves, possibly old cloth scraps, possibly something you have chosen not to examine too closely. There is a blanket. It smells like smoke because everything in Rome smells like smoke. The city runs on charcoal braziers and oil lamps, and the cumulative effect of 1 million people burning things indoors to cook and stay warm gives the entire city a permanent atmospheric haze that sits somewhere between cozy and suffocating. Your room is small. We're talking perhaps 3 meters by 4 meters if you are lucky. It contains your bed, a small wooden chest, possibly a stool, and whatever you keep on hooks on the wall. There are no wardrobes, no closets, no decorative furniture. The walls might be plastered and painted if the landlord ever made the investment, which is unlikely, because Roman landlords in the ancient world were exactly as invested in property upkeep as you might fear they would be. There is a window. It has no glass. Glass in the modern sense does exist in Rome, but it is expensive, wavy, and mostly translucent rather than transparent. Your window is covered with a wooden shutter, and right now it is doing almost nothing against the cold night air. You wake up cold and slightly damp, because the building's walls are thin enough that weather becomes part of your interior experience. And then there is the smell. Oh, the smell. There is no running water on your floor. There is no toilet on your floor. There is a shared latrine somewhere at street level and a water fountain at the end of the block, and the gap between those amenities and your 4th floor room is your problem to solve every single morning. Many residents solve it by keeping a chamber pot under the bed. Many residents solve the chamber pot problem by emptying it out the window. Roman law technically prohibited this, requiring citizens to call out a warning before dumping waste into the street. Roman law was also technically ignored with spectacular regularity. The street below your window is already alive with noise even before dawn. Rome never truly sleeps. Wheeled vehicles were banned from the city center during daylight hours to reduce congestion, which means every merchant, every delivery cart, every construction hauler came through at night. The resulting nocturnal symphony of iron-rimmed wheels on stone cobblestones, shouting drivers, protesting oxen, and the general chaos of a pre-industrial megacity in full nighttime swing is simply your ambient sleep soundtrack. Philosopher and writer Juvenal, who lived through this era, once complained that only a man with money could sleep in Rome because the noise of the streets was relentless. He was not exaggerating. This is your morning. Not an alarm, not a sunrise, but the accumulated din of 1 million people going about their lives at maximum volume directly outside your window. You open your eyes. Today begins. Nature is calling. Loudly. In the 21st century, this is a minor inconvenience. You roll out of bed, pad across clean tile, and everything is handled with the press of a lever. In Rome in 100 AD, the situation is considerably more theatrical. If you are using a chamber pot, congratulations, you are participating in the most private toilet experience available to you on the upper floors of a Roman insula. The pot is ceramic, squat, and unmistakably functional. You use it, you cover it, and you make a note to deal with the contents later, which almost certainly means depositing them in the large clay amphora that your landlord has placed at the base of the building specifically to collect such contributions. Urine, specifically, was collected and sold. Fullers, the workers responsible for cleaning and processing wool cloth, used aged urine as a cleaning agent because of its ammonia content. So what you are depositing is, in a very real sense, an economic contribution to the Roman textile industry. You are practically a philanthropist. If you make the trip down the stairs to the communal street-level latrine, you will encounter something that modern visitors to reconstructed Roman sites find genuinely disorienting: a public toilet that is extremely social. Roman public latrines, known as foraci, were rooms lined on 2 or 3 sides with stone or marble benches, beneath which ran a continuous channel of flowing water that carried waste away. There were holes cut into the bench at regular intervals. There were no dividing walls, no stalls, no privacy. You sit down next to whoever has sat down next to you, and you do your business in full public view. People talked. People conducted business. People exchanged gossip, argued about chariot racing factions, and debated the latest news from the Senate. Going to the toilet was a social activity in exactly the same way that sitting around a table is a social activity. The Romans were not bothered by this. The Romans were bothered by very few things that we would find alarming and completely unbothered by several things we would consider mandatory. Wiping was accomplished with a sponge on a stick, called a xylospongium. The sponge sat in a channel of running salt water at the base of the bench, available to all users in sequence. This is approximately as hygienic as it sounds. The germ theory of disease was roughly 1,700 years away from being articulated, so no one in this scenario is particularly concerned about cross-contamination, mostly because they lack the conceptual framework to be concerned about it. Afterward, you wash your hands if there is a water basin nearby, which in nicer latrines there sometimes is. Then you head back into the street. The streets, meanwhile, are worth a moment of description. Roman streets were paved with large flat stones, still visible today in the ruins of Pompeii and Rome itself. They were raised in the center to allow rainwater and, let's say, other liquids to drain toward gutters on either side. Stepping stones were placed at crossings, elevated enough that pedestrians could step across without putting their sandals directly into whatever was flowing along the gutter channel. Carts and wagons had wheels spaced to fit between the stepping stones, which is why the ruts worn into those paving stones at Pompeii are always a specific width apart. Despite this engineering, the streets smelled powerfully. A mix of animal waste from pack animals and the occasional livestock, being moved through the city, human waste that hadn't quite made it to the appropriate receptacle, rotting food scraps from the open-air food stalls, the tang of the tanneries, and the general olfactory signature of a pre-modern city operating at full capacity. Visitors from the countryside, according to various ancient sources, frequently commented on the overwhelming smell of Rome. Romans who had lived there all their lives appear to have stopped noticing. You navigate the stepping stones, sidestep a pile of something you do not inspect, and make your way toward the morning's first requirement: food. Breakfast in Rome is not what you might hope for. There is no kitchen in your apartment. There is almost certainly no kitchen in your entire building. Cooking over an open flame in a wooden-framed insula building packed with multiple families was how Roman apartment fires started, and Roman apartment fires were how entire city blocks ended their existence. The city burned with horrifying regularity. The Great Fire of 64 AD under Nero was the most famous disaster, but it was not an isolated event. Fires were a constant, gnawing fear in Rome, particularly in the multi-story residential districts where insulae stood cheek by jowl and water pressure at height was essentially non-existent. So most Romans, particularly the urban poor and working class, did not cook at home. They ate out. Rome had an astonishing number of food and drink establishments. Thermopolia, which were the ancient equivalent of fast food counters, were everywhere. You can see their ruins today, particularly in Pompeii and Herculaneum. They consisted of a stone counter with large ceramic vessels sunk into it, called dolia, in which hot food was kept warm. You walked up, pointed at what you wanted, and a portion was ladled out for you. The food itself was predominantly grain-based. Porridge called pools, which was the absolute staple of the Roman working diet, made from emmer wheat or spelt, boiled into a thick paste and flavored with whatever was available and affordable. Bread was everywhere. The city of Rome had hundreds of bakeries, and ancient records from Pompeii show that the bread trade was one of the most organized industries in the Roman world. Roman bread came in round loaves scored into segments, baked in wood-fired ovens, and sold still warm in the morning. It was denser than modern bread, made from coarser flour, and the lower your social status, the coarser the flour in your loaf. What goes with the bread? Olives, possibly. Olive oil, certainly. A smear of garum, the fermented fish sauce that was the universal condiment of the Roman world, something that modern palates often compare to Worcestershire sauce or a powerful anchovy paste. Romans put it on almost everything. They exported it across the empire in large ceramic amphorae. Finding traces of garum production facilities is a reliable archaeological marker of Roman settlement. They loved this stuff with a fervor that suggests it was genuinely delicious, provided you could get past the initial impression, which was that someone had left fish in the sun for an extended period of time and bottled the result. Which, to be fair, is exactly what they had done: dried figs. Lentils, chickpeas, salted olives, hard cheese. These are the foods of the Roman working class, and they are consumed rapidly, standing at a counter or perched on a low stone wall, because nobody in the morning rush of Rome has time to sit and savor anything. What are you drinking? Wine. Always wine. The Romans were not enthusiastic about drinking plain water, and for good reason. Roman water infrastructure was genuinely impressive, the aqueducts being one of the engineering marvels of the ancient world. But water quality was inconsistent, and the Romans understood that sick people drank bad water, even if they didn't understand the mechanism of why. Wine was drunk mixed with water, often in ratios of 1 part wine to 2 or 3 parts water, which produced something closer to a lightly flavored hydration drink than what we'd call wine today. Strong wine drunk unmixed was considered the behavior of people with poor judgment, barbarians and Greeks at symposia, and the Romans noted this disapprovingly in literature while also definitely doing it themselves. You finish your morning bread and porridge, wash it down with watered wine, wipe your hands on the inside of your tunic because there are no napkins, and it is time to go to work. Getting dressed in ancient Rome is, like most things in ancient Rome, more complicated than it looks and considerably less glamorous than the paintings suggest. The toga is the iconic Roman garment. You have seen it in every movie, every statue, every fresco. The flowing white wool garment draped artfully around the body, the very symbol of Roman civilization. Here is what the movies don't tell you about the toga. It was extremely difficult to put on, required another person to help drape it correctly, was impractical for any physical activity, got dirty almost immediately upon contact with Rome's streets, and was primarily the formal garment of Roman citizen men attending public functions, Senate sessions, legal proceedings, or formal ceremonies. Most Romans, most of the time, were not wearing togas. Working Romans wore a tunica, a simple rectangular garment, essentially a large piece of fabric folded and sewn at the sides and shoulders, belted at the waist. It fell to about the knee for men and to the ankle for women. Under the tunica, some people wore a loincloth. The tunica was made from wool or linen depending on the season and your income. Wool was warmer, linen was lighter. Being cold in a Roman winter was simply a chronic condition. The belted tunica was the everyday uniform of the Roman world from slave to senator in their private hours, and it was practical, cheap to produce, and wore out at roughly the pace you might expect from a society without synthetic fibers or industrial washing machines. Laundering clothes was outsourced to fulleries, professional cleaning operations that used the aforementioned aged urine, water, and foot treading in large vats to clean textiles. You bundled your clothes and took them periodically to the fuller. The process was time-consuming and cost money, which meant many people didn't do it as frequently as a modern nose might prefer. You wore your tunica for days or weeks between washings. In summer, in a city of 1 million people generating collective body heat and sharing public spaces, this produced an ambient olfactory experience that ancient visitors to Rome mentioned with some regularity, and that residents apparently filtered out through sheer familiarity. Shoes in Rome ranged from simple leather sandals, the most common footwear, to closed leather shoes called calci for formal occasions, to heavy military sandals for soldiers, to bare feet for slaves and the very poor. Roman sandals were actually relatively well made by ancient standards, soled with layered leather and sometimes with iron hobnails for durability. They did nothing whatsoever for ankle support, arch support, or the general wellness of feet that spent all day walking on stone cobblestones. Your feet hurt. They have always hurt. This is simply your experience of having feet in Rome. Once dressed, you present yourself to the world. You are wearing a slightly off-white tunica that has been washed maybe twice this month. Your sandals are worn smooth on the soles. Your hair, if you are a man, is cut short, because long hair on a Roman man was considered a barbarian affectation unless you were a philosopher specifically cultivating the aesthetic. If you are a woman, your hair is a considerably more serious undertaking, particularly among upper-class women whose elaborate hairstyles required slaves, pins, curling irons heated over coals, and a level of patience that suggests they had nowhere important to be for the first 2 hours of the morning. Among ordinary women, a simple braid or a twist held with basic pins was the daily reality. You step out into the street, the sun is barely up, Rome is already at full volume. Time to work. And here is where we have to introduce a crucial concept. Almost everything in Rome depended on who you were when you were born, and the gap between those categories was wider than any aqueduct the engineers ever built. If you are a free-born Roman citizen of the working class, you might be a craftsman. Rome was full of them. Potters, metal workers, woodworkers, weavers, bakers, fullers, dyers, butchers, fish sellers, sandal makers, jewelers, glass blowers, mosaic artists, painters, sculptors. The city ran on the labor of skilled craftsmen organized into professional associations called collegia, something like ancient guilds, that handled collective bargaining, professional standards, social support for members, and the organization of group religious observances. You worked in a workshop that opened directly onto the street. There was no separation between the workspace and the public thoroughfare. You made your goods in full view of passing foot traffic, advertised by smell and sound as much as by any signage, sold from the counter that formed the front edge of your shop, and lived in the rooms behind or above the workshop. The workshop was your entire world. Your working day was organized around daylight because artificial light was expensive and limited. Oil lamps burned olive oil, which cost money. Candles were less common and also cost money. You rose at dawn and worked until light failed in the late afternoon. There was a midday break when the heat of the Italian sun made working conditions unpleasant, during which you might eat, rest briefly, or visit the baths. Then work resumed until sundown. 6 days a week, roughly. Rome had religious festivals scattered throughout the calendar that functioned as public holidays, and the Romans did celebrate them with genuine enthusiasm. But between festivals, work was constant and rest was earned, not scheduled. If you are a slave, your situation is significantly worse. Rome's economy was built on slave labor to a degree that is difficult to overstate. Estimates suggest that somewhere between 20 and 30% of the population of Roman Italy during the imperial period were enslaved people. They worked in every sector of the economy: in mines, in fields, in households as domestic servants, in workshops as skilled craftsmen, in bakeries, in brothels, on construction sites. Some slaves held positions of considerable administrative responsibility, particularly in elite households, managing accounts, educating children, and acting as secretaries and physicians. Some enslaved people were highly educated, bought specifically for their skills. None of this changed their fundamental legal status. They were property. Roman law gave enslaved people no legal personhood whatsoever. They could not marry legally. Their children were enslaved. They could be bought, sold, beaten, sexually exploited, or killed, with varying degrees of legal consequence depending on the period. The ancient Roman jurist Gaius observed matter-of-factly that the fundamental division of persons in law was between free persons and slaves, as if this were a natural condition of the universe, rather than an engineered system of exploitation. Which is perhaps the most disturbing thing about Roman slavery. It was so thoroughly normalized that even many enslaved people internalized it. Freedom was not impossible. Manumission, the formal release of enslaved people by their owners, was relatively common in Rome compared to some other ancient slave societies, and freed slaves occupied a specific legal category with most citizen rights restored. But freedom was a gift of the master, not a right of the person. You work, whatever your status, whatever your trade, you work, and the city churns around you. Let's talk about the baths, because they deserve their own chapter. The Roman public baths, the thermae, are one of the genuine triumphs of ancient civilization and also one of the most interesting social experiments in urban history. They were free or nearly free. They were available to essentially everyone. They were enormous. The great imperial bath complexes in Rome, structures like the baths of Caracalla and the baths of Diocletian, could accommodate thousands of bathers simultaneously in a campus that included hot rooms, warm rooms, cold plunge pools, exercise yards, gardens, libraries, snack bars, and spaces for socializing that would be described today as lounges. The Roman bathing routine followed a sequence. First, you exercised running, wrestling, ball games, or lifting weights in the palestra, the outdoor exercise court. Then you worked through the rooms in sequence. The frigidarium was a cold room with a cold water pool. The tepidarium was a warm room, intermediate in temperature, where you acclimatized. The caldarium was the hot room, steamy and sweating, roughly equivalent to a modern sauna. Some facilities also had a laconicum, a dry heat room. You did not use soap in the modern sense. Roman bathers applied olive oil to their skin, worked it in during exercise to help the oil bind to dirt and sweat, and then scraped it all off with a curved metal implement called a strigil. This scraped-off mixture of oil, sweat, and skin cells was apparently considered valuable. Gladiators' strigil scrapings were reportedly sold as a cosmetic or medicinal product. You can make of that what you will. Baths were heated by a hypocaust system, hollow floors and walls through which hot air from a furnace circulated, raising the floor temperature in the heated rooms to levels that required bathers to wear sandals to avoid burning their feet. The engineering involved was genuinely sophisticated, requiring extensive maintenance by teams of slave laborers who stoked the furnaces and managed the water supply. The social dimension of bathing was as important as the hygienic one. You went to the baths to see people, to be seen, to conduct business, to gossip, to debate, to flirt, and to simply exist in a shared public space with your fellow Romans regardless of social class. The baths were one of the great democratic institutions of the Roman world, a space where a free citizen and a wealthy freedman might share the same pool, where you might find yourself soaking next to a senator or a schoolteacher or a recently retired soldier. They were also extremely noisy. The writer Seneca, who lived near a public bath complex, wrote a famous letter complaining about the sounds that drifted through the walls, the slap of hands on bodies during massage, the grunts of men exercising with weights, the arguments of people stealing towels, the singing of people who thought they sounded better than they did, the splash of someone jumping into the pool with maximum enthusiasm. He cataloged the racket with resigned irritation, and then noted that he had eventually learned to tune it all out, which suggests that either he developed remarkable concentration or he was lying. The baths represented something genuinely important about Roman civic culture, the idea that shared public infrastructure was a cornerstone of civilized life. They were funded by emperors, by wealthy citizens seeking political credit, by municipal funds. They were maintained by the state. They were available to the public. Whether this generosity was motivated by genuine social concern or by the political calculation that well-bathed, entertained people are less likely to riot, is a question that historians continue to debate, but the answer is probably both at once. Now let's talk about the thing that every tour group photograph captures and every textbook describes, but almost none of them adequately explain: the food, not the morning bread, actual dinner, the main meal of the Roman day. Romans ate their main meal in the late afternoon or early evening, after the working day was done and the baths had been visited. For the ordinary person, this was taken at home or at a thermopolium, and it was substantially what the morning meal was, but more of it. Grain-based dishes, legumes, vegetables, olives, whatever protein was affordable. But for the Roman elite, dinner, the cena, was something else entirely. It was a performance. Roman elite dining culture was built around the triclinium, the dining room, in which guests reclined on angled couches arranged in a U-shape around low tables. You did not sit upright to eat in polite Roman society. You reclined, propped on your left elbow, leaving your right hand free to reach for food. This is an extremely awkward position from which to eat soup, which is perhaps why Roman dinner menus leaned heavily toward finger foods and small portions of many dishes, rather than a single plate of something requiring a fork. And what were those dishes? Roman cuisine, particularly for the wealthy, was a thing of genuine complexity and occasional bewilderment. The only surviving Roman cookbook, a text associated with the name Apicius and compiled probably in the 4th or 5th century AD from earlier sources, contains recipes of extraordinary sophistication. Sauces layered with multiple spice combinations, dishes that mix sweet and salty in ways that feel modern, preparations of seafood and game that required considerable culinary skill. Apicius suggests cooking flamingo, stuffing dormice with pine nuts and spices, and preparing elaborate dishes of sow's womb. The Romans had strong feelings about food as status. Displaying wealth through the table was an important social performance. Importing expensive spices, serving exotic animals, presenting dishes in elaborate silver tableware. These were the signals of a host who had arrived. Garum was present at every table, humble and grand alike, but the quality of the garum mattered enormously. The finest grades, produced from specific fish in specific regions of the Mediterranean, cost extraordinary amounts. Pliny, the elder, noted that no liquid except perfume was sold at higher prices, which tells you something about both Roman cuisine and Roman perfume. Wine was essential and was classified obsessively by region, vintage, and grade. Certain vintages were considered legendary. Wine was stored in large ceramic amphoras sealed with resin or pitch, aged in wine cellars, and served at dinner parties with the same social weight that a labeled bottle of Burgundy carries today. Serving wine that was too young or too cheap was a social offense. Serving wine that was too good to guests below your social station was considered a waste. Navigating the wine question at a Roman dinner party was a social minefield with stakes that the Romans took with complete seriousness. Dinner parties were where alliances were forged, where patrons showed favor to clients, where social debts were incurred and repaid, where marriages were negotiated and careers were made. The dining room was a political space dressed up as a comfortable room, and nothing about it was accidental. Let's step back from the dinner table and talk about something that the Romans understood with a clarity that modern cities are still catching up to. The difference between the wealthy and everyone else was absolute, visible, and built into the physical fabric of the city itself. Rome was not a classless society. It was not even close to a classless society. It was one of the most rigidly stratified social orders the ancient world produced, and that stratification expressed itself in every dimension of daily life. At the top sat the imperial family, the emperor and his household, whose power was in theory and practice absolute. Below them, the senatorial class, the old aristocracy, defined by an enormous property qualification and membership in the Senate. Below them, the equestrian class, the knights, wealthy businessmen and military officers who formed the upper tier of the professional administrative class. Below them, the free-born citizens of the working class. Below them, freed slaves who had been granted citizenship. Below them, free non-citizens from across the empire. And below all of them, enslaved people. Each category had its own legal rights, its own social obligations, its own dress codes, literally. Laws called sumptuary legislation specified what kinds of clothing and adornment people of different ranks were permitted to wear. Senators wore tunics with a broad purple stripe. Equestrians wore a narrower purple stripe. Ordinary citizens wore plain white wool. The color purple itself, obtained from murex sea snails in a labor-intensive and expensive process, was so strongly associated with imperial power that wearing full purple was eventually reserved for the emperor alone. These distinctions mattered enormously to the Romans. They argued about rank with the passion that modern people reserve for sports fandom. They jockeyed for social position with strategies both subtle and ridiculous. The satirist Juvenal wrote entire volumes cataloging the social climbing, flattery, hypocrisy, and naked self-interest that characterized Roman social life among people desperate to move up the hierarchy. He wrote with the bitterness of someone who knew the system from the inside. The patron-client system was the social engine of Rome. Every person of means had clients, people of lower status who depended on them for favors, legal support, and access. Every person below the top of the hierarchy was simultaneously a patron to those below them and a client to those above. You showed up at your patron's house in the morning for the salutatio, the morning greeting, where clients gathered in the atrium to pay their respects and receive the sportula, a daily gift of food or money that represented the economic lifeline for many Romans. In return, you voted as your patron wished, supported his causes publicly, and added to the numerical impression of his social importance. This system was ancient, deeply embedded in Roman culture, and produced a city in which social relationships were economic relationships and economic relationships were political relationships, and the whole thing was impossible to disentangle. Being in Rome without a patron was being in Rome without a safety net. Being a patron without clients was being nobody in particular. You navigated this web every day, calculating your position, managing your obligations, trying to accumulate the small advantages that might improve your situation by a degree or two. Here is something that surprises most people about Rome. It was extraordinarily loud, perpetually overcrowded, and genuinely dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with gladiators or political assassinations. The streets were narrow. Even the major roads of Rome were dwarfed by what modern cities call streets. The Suburra, Rome's most densely populated working-class district, was a maze of alleys barely wide enough for two people to pass each other, lined with insulae that rose high enough to block most of the sky at street level, and through which the city's working population surged all day and well into the night. Street crime was common enough that Roman writers mention it casually. Pickpockets operated in crowds. Muggers worked dark alleys. Drunken fights outside taverns were a nightly occurrence. There was a corps of vigils, night watchmen who functioned as a combined fire brigade and basic police force, but their numbers were limited, their coverage was incomplete, and their effectiveness in preventing street crime was roughly what you'd expect from an understaffed organization covering a city of 1 million people. Fire was the existential threat. Rome burned repeatedly and significantly. The Great Fire of 64 AD destroyed or severely damaged somewhere between 1/3 and 2/3 of the city, depending on which ancient source you consult. The vigils were primarily trained as firefighters, using bucket chains and demolition to create fire breaks, but in the densely packed districts of the city where wooden-framed buildings stood closely packed together, fire could move with horrifying speed. The sound of the vigils shouting fire in the night was one of the sounds that woke Romans from sleep in cold terror. And then there was the collapse. Insulae were speculative investment properties in many cases, built quickly to house as many people as possible and generate maximum rental income for their owners. Roman building codes existed, but enforcement was inconsistent. The result was a class of buildings that were structurally marginal, built on inadequate foundations, extended upward beyond their load-bearing capacity, and maintained to a standard that modern structural engineers would describe using words unsuitable for a history channel. Buildings fell down, sometimes in the night, taking their sleeping occupants with them. Sometimes in the heat of the day, triggered by the vibration of heavy cart traffic, or simply by the accumulated weight of too many people in too little space. Juvenal writes about this too. He catalogues the hazards of walking under upper-floor windows where flower pots might fall, of sleeping in buildings where the floor above might give way, of navigating streets where collapsing facades were a periodic fact of life. He is satirizing, but he is not inventing. The Emperor Augustus, according to Suetonius, set a height limit on insulae of 70 Roman feet. Nero revised it downward after the Great Fire. Building regulations were periodically tightened after disasters and periodically ignored once the immediate emergency passed. This cycle of disaster, regulation, and noncompliance will feel extremely familiar to anyone who has followed modern urban housing issues. You walk carefully in Rome, you look up, you listen, and you try not to think too hard about what is holding the building above your head in its proper configuration. Medicine in Rome was better than in many ancient civilizations and considerably worse than in any modern one, which is perhaps the most diplomatic assessment possible. The Romans absorbed a great deal of Greek medical knowledge, particularly the work associated with Hippocrates and his followers, who had developed a sophisticated theoretical framework based on the balance of 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Sound familiar? The Romans didn't invent this theory, but they embraced it with enthusiasm and built their entire medical practice around it. Roman physicians, medici, were a professional class ranging from highly educated elite practitioners who served emperors and senators to street corner herbalists selling remedies of dubious effectiveness from baskets in the Forum. Galen of Pergamon, who lived in the 2nd century AD and served as physician to the Emperor Marcus Aurelius among others, was perhaps the most influential physician in the ancient world. His writings shaped medical theory in Europe for over 1,000 years after his death, which is either a testament to his genius or a cautionary tale about the persistence of outdated ideas, depending on your perspective. Galenical medicine was sophisticated in some ways. Galen performed dissections, observed anatomy, described physiological processes with considerable accuracy in some areas, and developed a pharmacopoeia of herbal treatments, some of which modern pharmacology has identified as genuinely effective. He also held firmly to the humor-based disease model, performed surgical procedures without anesthesia or antisepsis, and recommended treatments including bloodletting, purgatives, and emetics that in retrospect did more harm than good in many situations. Roman surgery was, in fact, surprisingly advanced. Roman surgical instruments excavated from sites around the empire reveal a range of specialized tools: scalpels, forceps, probes, hooks, dilators, catheters. Roman military medicine, in particular, operated at a level of organized sophistication that would not be matched again until the early modern period. Military hospitals, called valetudinaria, were permanent facilities in Roman legionary fortresses, staffed with trained surgeons and support personnel, designed to receive, treat, and return to service a constant flow of wounded soldiers. The Roman army's investment in soldier health was driven by practical calculation. Trained legionaries took years and significant resources to produce, and losing them to preventable infection was expensive. But for the ordinary urban Roman, medical care was a gamble. You consulted whatever healer you could access and afford. You took whatever was prescribed. You visited temples associated with Asclepius, the god of medicine, where the sick slept hopping for divine healing dreams. You applied poultices of herbs, ingested concoctions of wine and various plant materials, had a barber perform minor surgical procedures, or simply endured. Childbirth was attended by midwives, obstetricae, whose training and competence varied enormously. There were no sterile conditions, no pain relief beyond small amounts of wine and herbal preparations, and no ability to intervene surgically in a meaningful way if complications arose. Roman tombstones throughout the empire record women who died in childbirth with a regularity and casualness that tells its own story about the statistical reality of reproduction in the ancient world. Life expectancy at birth in the Roman Empire is estimated by modern scholars using a variety of evidence from tombstones, census records, and biological analysis at somewhere between 25 and 35 years. As with medieval figures, this is dragged downward dramatically by childhood mortality. If you survived to adulthood, your prospects improved significantly, but the adult years brought their own hazards: infection, industrial accident, violence, nutritional deficiency diseases, and the cumulative toll of hard physical labor on a human body that had no access to orthopedics, physiotherapy, or anti-inflammatory medication. You hurt more or less constantly. Your back, your feet, your hands, your teeth. Everyone hurts. This is the texture of life in a pre-modern body engaged in pre-modern labor. Speaking of teeth, let's pause here because Roman dentistry deserves its own moment of horrified fascination. Wealthy Romans actually had access to a surprising range of oral care products. Tooth powders made from crushed bone, oyster shell, powdered pumice, and various plant-derived abrasives were commercially available. Some Roman physicians recommended rubbing the teeth with wool soaked in honey as a cleaning treatment. Mouthwash preparations were made from various liquids including, again, urine, specifically Portuguese urine according to the poet Catullus, who mentioned this in the context of insulting someone's oral hygiene. The Romans had strong feelings about breath. Roman writers mention halitosis with a venom that suggests it was considered deeply socially offensive. Despite these efforts, Roman teeth, examined by archaeologists from skeletal remains across the empire, show significant pathology, where from coarse diets, decay from the sugars in wine and fruit, periodontal disease, tooth loss. The Romans who had survived to middle age with their full complement of teeth were comparatively fortunate. The treatment for a bad tooth was extraction, performed by physicians or by other practitioners using iron forceps with no anesthetic beyond alcohol or possibly opium-derived preparations in the cases of more sophisticated practitioners. False teeth existed. Archaeological finds include partial dentures made from human teeth or animal teeth, wire-bound together, and held in place against remaining natural teeth. These were primarily cosmetic devices for the wealthy rather than functional replacements, and they had the practical longevity you might expect from a pre-glue, pre-porcelain dental device held in place by bronze wire. Roman writers noted that the breath of people with bad teeth was unpleasant, which, given the treatments available, was presumably a persistent social reality across all classes. When Ovid wrote poetry about the seductive qualities of a beautiful smile, he was describing something that was genuinely unusual enough to be worth commenting on. Now, let us turn from the daily grind to something that defined Rome's public culture with a power we cannot overstate: entertainment. Because if there is one thing the Romans understood, it was that a city of 1 million people needed things to do, and they supplied those things with industrial efficiency and a flair for spectacle that has never quite been matched. The Colosseum, the Circus Maximus, the theater, these were not occasional treats. They were the permanent infrastructure of Roman public life. The Circus Maximus, the chariot racing venue, was the single largest entertainment facility in the ancient world, capable of holding somewhere between 150,000 and 250,000 spectators, depending on the packing arrangement. It occupied a natural valley between the Palatine and Aventine hills in central Rome, and had been used for racing in one form or another since the earliest days of the city. Chariot racing was Rome's equivalent of a national sport combined with a national religion combined with a stock market. Teams were organized around 4 colors: the greens, blues, reds, and whites, though by the late Republic and early Empire the greens and blues dominated. Betting on races was pervasive across all social classes. Emperors declared their team allegiance. Riots broke out over races. Successful charioteers were megastars who earned fortunes and commanded devoted followings. A race day at the Circus Maximus involved 12 laps around the central barrier, called the Spina, decorated with sculpture, obelisks, and the lap-counting devices the audience watched anxiously. 7 laps, about 5 kilometers, and then the turn, and the turn was where most of the crashes happened. Charioteers wound the reins around their waists to control their horses more effectively, which meant that if they crashed and were dragged, they needed a knife to cut themselves free before being trampled. Many didn't make it. The crowd loved this too. The Colosseum, formerly the Flavian Amphitheater, opened in 80 AD, accommodated somewhere between 50 and 80,000 spectators in tiered seating, arranged according to social rank, with the emperor's box at the prime sightline and the cheapest standing room at the top. The events staged there included animal hunts in the morning, where trained hunters called bestiarii faced a rotating cast of exotic animals shipped from across the empire: lions from North Africa, bears from the Germanic forests, elephants, rhinoceroses, hippopotami. Then executions of condemned criminals, sometimes staged with theatrical elaboration as mythological scenes. Then, in the afternoon, the gladiatorial combat that gave the venue its historical reputation. Gladiators were not quite what popular culture suggests. They were predominantly enslaved people, war captives, or condemned criminals trained in gladiatorial schools called ludi. Some were free volunteers who signed contracts trading their legal freedom temporarily for the pay, food, medical care, and fame of the gladiatorial career. They trained hard, ate well by Roman standards, received medical attention, and were organized into specific fighting types with standardized equipment. The heavy-armored secutor, the Netan trident retiarius, the smaller shielded thriques. Matches between different types created tactical variety that the audience followed with educated enthusiasm. Death at gladiatorial games was common but not universal. A wounded gladiator who had fought well could appeal for mercy and receive it from the crowd and ultimately from the editor, the sponsor of the games. Killing a trained, expensive gladiator unnecessarily was a financial loss as well as a social one. The proportion of matches that ended in death varied by period and by the philosophy of the sponsoring games. But the possibility was always real, and both participants and audience understood that. The Roman attitude toward this violence was complex and, to modern sensibility, deeply disturbing. Roman philosophers debated the ethics of gladiatorial games. Some condemned them as brutalizing. Others argued they instilled virtues of courage and facing death without complaint. The popular view was simply that they were entertaining, and the level of public enthusiasm for them was vast and continuous. Games were political tools. Emperors and aspiring politicians sponsored games to generate goodwill and demonstrate generosity. The equation was explicit and cynical and worked anyway. The phrase panem et circenses, bread and circuses, attributed to Juvenal, describes the Roman political calculation that keeping the urban population fed and entertained was the key to preventing social unrest. Juvenal was condemning the population for accepting this bargain. The emperors were implementing it as practical governance. Both were probably right. Let's talk about religion, because in Rome, religion was not a separate domain of life. It was woven through every moment of every day in ways that are difficult to fully convey to a modern secular perspective. Roman religion was polytheistic, practically oriented, and concerned primarily with maintaining the correct relationship between humans and the divine powers that govern the universe. This relationship was understood in contractual terms. You performed the proper ritual, the god received what was owed, and in return the god's favor protected you, your family, your crop, your army, your city. The Latin phrase do ut des, I give so that you may give, captures the essential logic. Religion was not primarily about belief or personal salvation. It was about correct practice and reciprocal obligation. The gods of the Roman state pantheon were numerous and had overlapping functions and complex genealogies that the Romans had largely inherited from the Greeks, matching their own native gods to Greek equivalents. Jupiter as Zeus, Juno as Hera, Mars as Ares, Mercury as Hermes, and so forth. These gods were worshipped through public temples, state rituals performed by specialized priests, and festivals organized through the Roman calendar. Roman priests were not a separate clerical class in the way that Christian priests or Jewish rabbis are. They were typically prominent citizens performing religious roles as part of their public obligations alongside political and military careers. Julius Caesar was Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of the Roman state religion. At the same time, he was fighting the Gallic Wars. Augustus held the same title while running the empire. Religion and political power were woven together by design. At the household level, religion was constant and immediate. The lararium, a small household shrine found in almost every Roman house and apartment, housed statuettes of the Lares, household gods who protected the family and the home, and the genius, the divine essence of the family's paterfamilias. Daily offerings of small cakes, wine, incense, and flowers were made at the lararium. Before meals, a portion might be set aside for the household gods. Before any significant undertaking, you consulted them. When something went wrong, the shrine was where you went first. The city was thick with temples of varying scales, from the massive temples of the Capitoline Hill to small neighborhood shrines at street corners. Every professional guild had its divine patron. Every major enterprise began with appropriate ritual. Every significant public decision was preceded by the consultation of augurs, priests trained to read divine will through the observation of bird behavior, the examination of sacrificial animal entrails, and other divinatory practices. The Romans were not superstitious in the modern dismissive sense. They had a systematic, rational framework for understanding divine communication, and they took it seriously. Rome was also religiously tolerant in a way that was practical rather than principled. As the empire expanded and absorbed peoples across 3 continents, it absorbed their gods too. Foreign gods were permitted their temples in Rome. Soldiers spread their own religious practices across the empire. Mystery religions from Egypt, Syria, and Persia, including the cults of Isis, Mithras, and others, attracted devoted followings in Rome itself. The empire's religious landscape was a diverse, layered, constantly evolving ecosystem. The one religious tradition that caused Rome consistent trouble was the one that demanded exclusivity. First Judaism, then Christianity. The refusal to acknowledge Rome's gods, participate in state religious observances, or make the routine gestures of civic religion that cemented Roman identity was not merely theologically puzzling to Roman authorities. It was politically suspicious. A citizen who would not pour a libation to the gods who protected Rome was a citizen whose loyalty was in question. The persecution of Christians was real and at times intense, though it was neither constant nor universal in the way that later Christian historiography sometimes suggested. For most of the first 2 centuries AD, Christianity was a minor sect navigating Roman society at low visibility. But the potential for conflict was structurally embedded in the incompatibility between Roman civic religion and Christian exclusivity, and that conflict would eventually shape the entire subsequent history of Western civilization. It is evening. The light is failing. Shops are closing. The smell of cooking fires and evening meals drifts through the streets. The first delivery carts are beginning to rattle through the gates as the daytime ban on wheeled traffic lifts. You are tired. Every part of you is tired. Your feet ache from the cobblestones. Your back aches from the work. Your eyes ache from the smoke and the dim light. You have navigated a day of social obligations, commercial activity, political positioning, physical labor, and the constant background negotiation of living in one of the densest human settlements that had ever existed on Earth. You go home. You climb the stairs of your insula. You eat whatever you have or can afford. You light a small oil lamp and sit in its narrow, warm circle of light, and for a little while you exist in the quietest moment the city allows you. The wheels of the delivery carts begin to grind on the stones below your window. The shouts of the drivers echo up the canyon of the building fronts. Somewhere nearby, someone is having an argument that will go on until past midnight. A baby is crying. A dog is barking at something in the alley. Welcome to Rome. It was filthy and magnificent, brutal and brilliant, overcrowded and alive with a density of human experience that the modern world has largely traded away in exchange for quieter streets and central heating. And through all its contradictions, through all its inequality and violence and noise and waste, it produced art that still stops people cold in museums, architecture that still stands 2,000 years later, legal principles that still underpin the systems of dozens of modern nations, and a literature that still teaches us who we are and how we got here. The Romans were not better or worse than us. They were us, pressing forward through the chaos with whatever they had, trying to make something meaningful out of the noise. Part 2, Napoleon Bonaparte, the man history couldn't contain. Before there was a legend, there was a boy. A small, thin, dark-haired boy on a large, complicated island who spoke French with an accent that made his classmates laugh, who burned with an intensity that confused people who didn't know how to read it, who read military history the way other children read fairy tales, who fell asleep at night imagining campaigns that had not yet been fought. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte, and he was born on August 15, 1769, in Ajaccio, on the island of Corsica. This timing was not incidental. France had purchased Corsica from the Republic of Genoa just 1 year earlier, in 1768, making Napoleon, technically, a French citizen, though Corsica had been French for just long enough to produce one French citizen before Napoleon's birth had to be considered his original nationality. His father, Carlo Bonaparte, was a lawyer of minor Corsican nobility, educated in Italy, politically connected enough to secure French patronage for his children after the annexation. His mother, Letizia Ramolino, was formidable in the way that people who have raised 8 children through poverty, political instability, and the death of a husband at 58 tend to be formidable. She is remembered in history primarily as Napoleon's mother, which is rather like nodding that the Rhine is a tributary. She was a force, and her son knew it and said so. Carlo secured royal scholarships for his sons to study in France. Napoleon, age 9, was sent to a preparatory school at Autun and then to a military academy at Brienne-le-Château. He was there for 5 years, and those years were not comfortable. His accent was thick. His family was impoverished by aristocratic standards. His nationality was ambiguous. His classmates, the sons of established French nobility, let him know about all of this at regular intervals, with the directness that children reserve for each other. Napoleon responded in the way that would define his entire subsequent career. He worked. He read everything available, absorbed military history with a systematic intensity that his instructors found remarkable, developed a mathematical ability that made him naturally suited for artillery and its equations of trajectory and charge, and cultivated the absolute refusal to be diminished by circumstances that remain perhaps his most consistent characteristic from childhood to St. Helena. He graduated from the École Militaire in Paris, France's premier military school, in 1 year instead of the standard 2. He was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the artillery in September 1785, at the age of 16. The world into which Lieutenant Bonaparte graduated was itself on the edge of an explosion. France in 1785 was a kingdom in slow-motion fiscal and political crisis, its finances wrecked by decades of warfare, and the enormous expense of supporting the American Revolution, its social order increasingly strained by Enlightenment ideas about equality and the legitimate basis of political authority, its monarchy presided over by a decent but fundamentally inadequate king named Louis XVI, who was facing a problem that would have tested anyone. Napoleon, in his early military postings, was present for history without yet making it. He was stationed in Valence, and then Auxonne, reading voraciously, conducting amateur surveys and artillery experiments, sending money home to his family, and watching the political temperature rise. Then 1789 arrived, and everything changed. The French Revolution is one of those events that historians describe as a watershed, a dividing line between the world before and the world after, and for once the cliché is accurate. The storming of the Bastille on July 14, 1789, was the symbolic beginning of a decade of convulsion that would execute a king, a queen, and thousands of others, abolish the old social order, declare the rights of man, produce the reign of terror, exhaust itself in blood, and ultimately summon to the foreground of history a young artillery officer from Corsica who understood better than almost anyone alive what the new world required. For Napoleon, the revolution was both a catastrophe and a gift. It was a catastrophe because it initially destabilized everything. His regiment was disrupted. His family's Corsican political position became complicated. He spent years navigating between Corsica and France, involved in Corsican political conflicts that eventually forced the Bonaparte family to flee to mainland France in 1793 as refugees after a conflict with the Corsican nationalist Pasquale Paoli. It was a gift because it destroyed the system of aristocratic preferment that had blocked his advancement at every turn. In the old France, officers were promoted on the basis of birth and connection. In revolutionary France, officers were promoted on the basis of competence, and Napoleon Bonaparte had nothing but competence in abundance. His first major opportunity came in 1793 at the Siege of Toulon, where royalist forces had handed the crucial Mediterranean port to the British. A 24-year-old artillery commander, Napoleon redesigned the French artillery positions, identified the critical high ground that dominated the harbor, pressed his plan against resistance from superior officers who didn't quite see it yet, and when the plan was executed, it worked. The British evacuated. Toulon fell. Napoleon was promoted to brigadier general. He was 24 years old, and he had just demonstrated the characteristic that would define his military genius: the ability to see, faster and more clearly than everyone around him, where the decisive point of an engagement lay, and then to concentrate his resources at that point, with an economy of force that made his armies seem to fight above their actual weight. The subsequent years were not uniformly triumphant. He was briefly arrested after Thermidor, the coup that brought down Robespierre and ended the Terror, on suspicion of Jacobin sympathies. The charge didn't stick. He spent some time in Paris, maneuvering for position, nearly joining the Ottoman army as a technical advisor at one point before a better opportunity presented itself. That opportunity was the command of French forces in Italy. The Italian campaign of 1796 to 1797 is where the world met Napoleon Bonaparte in full, and the world was not prepared. The French army of Italy was, at the moment Napoleon assumed command in March 1796, in poor shape. It was undersupplied, underfed, poorly equipped, and demoralized by a series of inconclusive campaigns. Its officers were skeptical of their new 26-year-old general, promoted over many of their heads, who arrived with big ideas and little established reputation outside of a successful artillery siege. They were about to receive an education. Napoleon issued proclamations to his troops that have gone down in history as models of the motivational art. He told them they were about to fight in one of the most fertile plains in the world, that rich provinces and great cities would be in their power, where they would find honor, glory, and riches. He made this speech while his soldiers were wearing shoes with holes in them, which tells you something about Napoleon's relationship with practical constraints. But then he made good on it. The Italian campaign was a masterclass in what military historians call the War of the Central Position, and what Napoleon simply called moving fast. Facing two separate enemy armies, Austrian and Piedmontese, he moved between them before they could concentrate, defeated each in turn, and in 6 weeks of lightning operations had knocked Piedmont out of the war and driven the Austrians back into Lombardy. He then proceeded to fight 14 pitched battles in as many months, reorganizing his supply system to make his army live off the land they were conquering, using speed and concentration at the decisive point as a substitute for the numerical superiority he rarely had. By the time the Italian campaign ended in 1797, France had won terms it had never expected. The Treaty of Campo Formio gave France effective control of northern Italy and confirmed Napoleon as the most brilliant military commander Europe had seen in a generation. He was 27. He negotiated the treaty personally, as if the government in Paris were a detail rather than his employer. The Directory, France's ruling committee, received his diplomatic decisions essentially as fait accompli. Back in Paris, he was mobbed, celebrated, analyzed. The directors who governed France regarded him with the slightly nervous admiration that people in charge reserve for the person who is clearly more capable than they are and may at any moment notice it. The Egyptian campaign of 1798 and 1799 is where Napoleon's story gets genuinely strange, and also genuinely revealing. The Directory wanted him gone from Paris. A man of his reputation and popularity sitting in the capital was a political variable they preferred to have at a distance. Napoleon himself was restless and thinking beyond Europe. He proposed a campaign to Egypt that would simultaneously strike at British interests, open a route to India, spread French Enlightenment civilization to the east, and provide him with an adventure worthy of Alexander the Great, whom he had been reading about since childhood. This tells you something important about Napoleon. His ambitions were not purely military or purely political. He genuinely believed in the civilizing mission that France carried in his conception of the world, the idea that the scientific, rational, organized French model of society was what humanity should aspire to, and that spreading it was both an opportunity and an obligation. He brought 167 scholars and scientists with him to Egypt, the Commission of Sciences and Arts, charged with studying and documenting everything they found. Their work produced the monumental description de l'Egypte, and, as a side effect, included the discovery of the Rosetta Stone, which would eventually unlock the entire field of Egyptology. Napoleon thought of himself earnestly as a vehicle of history and civilization, not just a military commander. This was not entirely vanity. It was also a coherent intellectual position of the time, and it coexisted, somewhat uncomfortably, with the reality of his campaigns, which included massacres of prisoners, punishing suppression of resistance, and the fundamental arrogance of arriving in someone else's country and explaining to them how they should live. The Egyptian campaign was militarily mixed. The land battles were French victories. The decisive naval battle of the Nile was a catastrophic French defeat when Rear Admiral Horatio Nelson destroyed the French fleet at Aboukir Bay in August 1798, stranding the army of Egypt without supply lines or escape routes, and transforming a strategic gamble into a potentially disastrous trap. Napoleon eventually left Egypt quietly in August 1799, handing command to his subordinates, when news from France made it clear that the political moment he had been waiting for was arriving. He sailed back to France, landed at Frejus, was received with national rejoicing, and within weeks executed the coup of 18 Brumaire that brought down the Directory and established the consulate. He emerged from the new constitutional arrangements as first consul, which was in practice the chief executive of France with powers substantially beyond what the title suggested. He was 30 years old. He was now ruling France. The consulate period, roughly 1799 to 1804, is in many ways Napoleon's most impressive achievement, and it is the one least visible in popular imagination, which fixates on the battles and the exile and the legend. Because in these years, Napoleon governed. He governed with the same restless, systematic, detail-oriented energy that he brought to military campaigns. He worked extraordinary hours, famously sleeping only 4 to 5 hours a night, dictating correspondence to secretaries who worked in shifts to keep up with him, reviewing legislation, making administrative decisions, conducting policy debates, reforming virtually every major institution of French government. The Napoleonic Code, enacted in 1804, was his single most durable achievement. It was a comprehensive civil legal code that replaced the patchwork of feudal customs, Roman law traditions, and Revolutionary-era legislation that had constituted French law, and replaced it with a unified, rationally organized system based on clear principles: equality before the law, protection of property rights, freedom of contract, secular marriage and divorce, the suppression of hereditary privilege. The code was carried across Europe in the baggage of Napoleon's armies, and its influence on the legal systems of continental Europe, Latin America, the Canadian province of Quebec, and the state of Louisiana persists directly to the present day. If you have ever signed a contract in France, or gotten married in Chile, or consulted Louisiana property law, you have been operating inside a framework that Napoleon commissioned. He reorganized French education, establishing the lycée system of secondary schools that still forms the backbone of French public education. He reformed the tax system. He created the Bank of France. He negotiated the Concordat of 1801 with Pope Pius VII, healing the breach between the French state and the Catholic Church that the Revolution had torn open, restoring the Church's public role while keeping it firmly subordinate to state authority. He reorganized local government into prefectures under appointed prefects, who reported directly to Paris, creating an administrative centralization that France still operates today. He also established or reinforced censorship of the press, maintained an extensive political police under the notoriously effective Joseph Fouché, required loyalty oaths, suppressed political opposition, and gradually concentrated personal power in ways that made the consulate increasingly personal government. The line between inspired administrator and authoritarian ruler is one that Napoleon spent his entire governing career walking, and the trajectory was always in one direction. The empire, proclaimed in December 1804, with Napoleon crowning himself Emperor of the French in Notre Dame Cathedral, with Pope Pius VII present but notably not actually performing the coronation, was not a surprise to anyone paying attention. It was the logical conclusion of the path Napoleon had been on since Brumaire. The self-crowning is worth a moment. Taking the crown from the Pope's hands and placing it on his own head was a deliberate statement. This authority derives from my capacity and my relationship with the French people, not from the blessing of Rome. It was theatrical, calculated, and completely in character. The years of the empire, 1804 to 1814 and briefly again in 1815, were years of almost incomprehensible military activity across the entirety of Europe. The names of the battles form a roll call that military historians study with reverence, and that Napoleon himself organized his own mythology around. Austerlitz, Jena, Wagram, Borodino. The Austerlitz campaign of 1805 is generally considered his greatest military achievement, a battle in which he feigned weakness on his right flank to encourage the Austro-Russian coalition forces to concentrate their attack there, then struck their exposed center and left with devastating force, breaking their army in less than 3 hours and winning one of the most decisive engagements in European military history. His strategic vision was genuinely original. He grasped, earlier than his contemporaries, that the new mass armies made possible by conscription and nationalist mobilization could be used differently than the professional armies of the earlier 18th century. He didn't move slowly, trying to avoid battles and maneuver opponents into untenable positions before engaging. He pursued decisive engagement, sought to destroy enemy armies rather than merely defeat them in specific actions, and moved with a speed that repeatedly left opponents reacting to what he had already done rather than planning responses to what he was about to do. His corps system, in which his army was permanently organized into self-contained combined arms corps, capable of operating independently and foraging for their own supply, was a major organizational innovation that allowed him to concentrate forces from widely dispersed positions faster than his enemies could anticipate or respond to. He was helped by opponents who were, for much of the period, fighting him individually rather than in sustained coalition. The major European powers, Austria, Prussia, Russia, Britain, tended to make peace separately after military defeat and then return to the fight when they had recovered, which meant Napoleon was essentially fighting a series of wars against individual opponents rather than a sustained united coalition. Britain, protected by the Channel and dominant at sea, was never beatable on land and provided money and diplomacy to keep coalitions forming. Napoleon's answer to British commercial power was the continental system, an economic blockade of British goods from European ports, which damaged British trade, severely damaged European economies, and ultimately generated the political resistance from his allies and conquered territories that contributed to his downfall. Russia, we have to talk about Russia. The decision to invade Russia in 1812 is Napoleon's most analyzed strategic error, and the debate about whether it was a rational gamble gone wrong or an overreach born of hubris has been ongoing for 2 centuries. The immediate cause was Tsar Alexander I's withdrawal from the continental system, which was bleeding Russia's economy, and which Alexander calculated he could resist given the logistical difficulties of fighting in Russia. Napoleon calculated he could force compliance by invading, winning a quick decisive battle and imposing terms. He had done this to Austria and Prussia multiple times. He expected it would work on Russia. It did not work on Russia. The Grand Armée that crossed the Niemen River on June 24, 1812, was the largest military force assembled in European history to that point, somewhere between 400 and 500,000 men from across the Empire and Allied states. They entered Russia confident, organized, and entirely unprepared for what Russia was about to do to them. Russia, under the strategy that has been attributed to various commanders but was ultimately enforced by geography, retreated, and burned what it left behind. The cities Napoleon expected to take and use as supply bases were found empty or ablaze. The decisive battle he needed to fight didn't happen until Borodino on September 7th, by which point the army was already being eroded by starvation, exhaustion, dysentery, and the sheer distance from everything it needed to function. Borodino was tactically the bloodiest single day of the Napoleonic Wars, and it settled nothing. The Russians retreated again. Napoleon entered Moscow a week later to find most of the population gone and the city on fire, torched by the Russians themselves rather than surrendered intact. He sat in Moscow for 5 weeks, waiting for Alexander to negotiate. Alexander did not negotiate. The retreat from Moscow began in October, and it became one of history's most terrible episodes. Winter arrived early and savage. The army, which had already been severely depleted, began dying at catastrophic speed. Temperatures dropped to -30°C. Men froze at their campsites. Horses died by the thousands, and with them the artillery and supply wagons. Cossack cavalry and Russian regulars harassed the flanks constantly. The Grand Armée that had entered Russia with 500,000 men came back with perhaps 90,000, and many of those were broken in body and spirit. Napoleon's reputation for military invincibility evaporated with the retreat from Moscow. His enemies, watching from the edges, drew the lesson that he could be beaten. The coalition that formed against him in 1813 was more determined and better coordinated than its predecessors. The Battle of Leipzig in October 1813, known as the Battle of Nations, was the largest battle in European history before the First World War, and Napoleon lost it. He abdicated in April 1814 and was sent to the island of Elba, with the title emperor and a miniature realm that was a humiliation in everything except the paperwork. He was there for 10 months. Then he escaped, landed in southern France, and marched north with the few men who had accompanied him into exile, gathering troops as he went as if by magnetic attraction. The Bourbon King Louis XVI, restored by the Allies, fled. Napoleon entered Paris in triumph without firing a shot. The 100 Days, March to June 1815, ended at Waterloo. The Battle of Waterloo on June 18, 1815, has been analyzed, debated, reconstructed, and re-reconstructed more than almost any battle in history, and historians still argue about its decisive factors. Was it the rain of the night before that delayed Napoleon's morning attack and allowed the Prussians time to march to Wellington's aid? Was it the failure to fully destroy the Prussian army at Ligny 2 days earlier? Was it Napoleon's uncharacteristic caution, possibly related to his health? Was it Marshal Ney's impulsive and premature cavalry charges against unbroken British infantry squares? All of these things contributed. Together they produced a defeat. Napoleon abdicated again 4 days later. This time there was no island kingdom with an imperial title. The Allies sent him to St. Helena, a speck of rock in the South Atlantic, as remote as they could manage, with a British garrison to make sure he stayed there. He arrived in October 1815. He was 46 years old. He would live there for 6 years, dictating his memoirs, walking in the garden, arguing with his British keepers, and constructing the narrative of his life and legacy with the same deliberate attention to effect that he had brought to everything else. He died on May 5, 1821. The cause was probably stomach cancer, though the theory that he was gradually poisoned by arsenic in the wallpaper of his damp rooms has intermittently attracted attention from historians. He was 51. What do you do with Napoleon Bonaparte once the military campaigns are over? You try to understand what he was, and this is harder than it looks. He was a product of the Enlightenment who built an empire. He was a revolutionary who made himself a hereditary monarch. He was a man who proclaimed the principles of the revolution across Europe at the point of a bayonet, and then systematically restricted the freedoms of the French people at home. He was a military genius who made an unforced strategic error in Russia that ended everything. He was a legislator whose code is still law and a conqueror whose conquests all eventually ended. His admirers emphasized the code, the administrative reforms, the modernization of French and European institutions, the way his conquests inadvertently spread liberal legal principles across a continent that had been governed by feudal custom, the way the resistance to his occupation helped crystallize modern nationalist movements in Germany, Italy, Spain, and Poland that would reshape the 19th century. His critics emphasized the deaths. The Napoleonic Wars killed somewhere between 3 and 5 million soldiers and a comparable number of civilians across Europe and in campaigns in Egypt, the Caribbean, and elsewhere. He reintroduced slavery in the French colonies after the Revolution had abolished it, a decision driven by economic calculation and colonial politics that stands as one of the most morally indefensible of his career. His treatment of conquered peoples, particularly in Spain during the bloody Peninsular War, generated atrocities that Francisco Goya documented in his Disasters of War Prince, with a searing honesty that still disturbs. The truth is probably that Napoleon was large enough to contain the contradictions, that the categories of hero and villain are inadequate for someone who operated at his scale, and that what makes him historically important is less what he was personally than what he revealed about the modern world that was taking shape around him. He revealed that mass politics and mass armies and nationalist ideology were the new forces that would drive history. He revealed that legal and administrative rationalization could reshape societies faster than anyone had imagined. He revealed that concentrated personal power and liberal principles were in fundamental tension that no individual genius could fully resolve. He revealed, in Russia and at Waterloo, that even the most astonishing talent operates within constraints that eventually make themselves felt. He died on his rock in the South Atlantic, still dictating, still working, still trying to control his own narrative from a position of absolute powerlessness. He insisted to the end that he had been the liberator of peoples, the bearer of revolution's better principles, the victim of his enemy's fear rather than his own errors. He was also Napoleon Bonaparte, and the world has never quite managed to stop arguing about him, which is probably exactly how he would have wanted it. Part 3. The Mystery of Tutankhamun, a boy king's eternal secret. He ruled for approximately 10 years. He died at approximately 18. He was not, by ancient Egyptian standards, a particularly significant pharaoh. His reign was short, his monuments modest by comparison to his predecessors, his political achievements ambiguous. In the long catalogue of Egyptian rulers that stretches across 3,000 years of continuous civilization, Tutankhamun was a footnote. And yet, in November 1922, A British archaeologist named Howard Carter pressed a candle through a hole in a sealed doorway in the Valley of the Kings near Luxor, and the world changed. The story of Tutankhamun is really three stories braided together. The story of who he was and how he lived and died in ancient Egypt. The story of the extraordinary chance that preserved his tomb against 3,000 years of robbers and sand. And the story of what his discovery in 1922 revealed to the modern world about the civilization that produced him. All three are worth telling. He was born, as far as modern scholarship can determine, somewhere around 1341 BC, during the turbulent period immediately following the reign of the pharaoh Akhenaten, who had spent his tenure overturning several thousand years of Egyptian religious practice by declaring the sun disk At to be the sole divine object of worship and moving Egypt's capital to a new city he built from scratch in the desert called Akhetaten, known today as Amarna. Akhenaten's religious revolution was genuine, unsettling, and ultimately unsuccessful. Whether it represented sincere theological conviction or a calculated political move to weaken the entrenched priestly class of Amen by cutting off their resources, is a question that Egyptologists have been debating for over a century. Whatever Akhenaten's motivations, his successors reversed everything he had done with notable thoroughness. Tutankhamun, born Tutankhaten, meaning living image of the Aten, changed his name to Tutankhamun, meaning living image of Amen, early in his reign, signaling the shift back to traditional Egyptian polytheism and the restoration of Amen's primacy. His relationship to Akhenaten is genetically confirmed. DNA analysis of his mummy, conducted in 2010, established that Tutankhamun's father was indeed Akhenaten. His mother appears to have been one of Akhenaten's sisters, which means Tutankhamun was the product of a sibling marriage, a practice not uncommon in the Egyptian royal family for reasons of dynastic legitimacy. He became pharaoh at approximately 8 or 9 years of age, which meant he required regents to govern in practice while he held the ceremonial and religious roles of kingship. The most powerful figures around him were the general Horemheb, who would eventually succeed him, and the official Eye, who served as a kind of senior advisor and also eventually succeeded to the throne briefly after Tutankhamun's death. The reality of power during Tutankhamun's reign was probably that these older, more experienced officials made the major decisions, while the boy king performed the rituals and ceremonies that the position required. What was his life like? Rich in material goods to a degree that is genuinely staggering, as the contents of his tomb would demonstrate 3,000 years later. Tutankhamun had jewels, clothing, furniture, chariots, weapons, games, musical instruments, and sacred objects of breathtaking craftsmanship. The ancient Egyptians believed that the necessities of life in this world were also the necessities of life in the next, so everything a pharaoh would need for eternity was buried with him. What survived in Tutankhamun's tomb when Carter opened it gave us the single most complete picture we have of the material culture of the Egyptian royal court in the New Kingdom period. He hunted. Evidence from objects in his tomb and from analysis of his mummy suggests he was an active young man who participated in chariot racing and hunting. He died young, and the question of how occupied archaeologists and forensic specialists for decades. The story of his tomb's survival is a study in near misses that reads like narrative fiction. The Valley of the Kings, the burial ground for pharaohs of the New Kingdom period, was robbed systematically in antiquity. Ancient Egyptian tomb robbers were persistent, knowledgeable, and often included the very workers who had built the tombs. By the time of the later dynasties, the situation had become severe enough that priests removed the royal mummies from their original tombs and reburied them collectively in hidden caches to protect them. The cache discovered in 1881 at Deir el-Bahri included the mummies of dozens of pharaohs, among them Rameses the Great, Seti I, and Thutmose III. Tutankhamun's tomb, numbered KV62 in the modern archaeological catalog, survived because it was buried. In the ancient period, robbers had breached it at least twice, evidenced by the disordered state of certain items near the entrance when Carter found it. But they had been caught or interrupted, the breaches resealed, and the tomb's location subsequently lost. Later, workers cutting the tomb of the pharaoh Ramesses VI above and nearby deposited debris that buried the entrance to KV-62 under several feet of stone chips, hiding it so effectively that it was not found again for 3,000 years. Howard Carter arrived in the Valley of the Kings in 1907, initially as an employee of the American businessman Theodore Davis, who held the excavation concession. Davis, after years of work, concluded in 1912 that the valley was exhausted, that there was nothing significant left to find. He was spectacularly wrong. Carter believed Tutankhamun's tomb was still out there, based on his analysis of objects that had already been found bearing Tutankhamun's name. He secured the backing of his patron Lord Carnarvon, and spent years systematically excavating areas of the valley that Davis had not fully explored. By November 1922, after years of digging and increasingly expensive seasons with nothing to show for them, Carnarvon was losing patience. Carter was given one final season. On November 4, 1922, a worker's pickaxe struck the top of a stone step. By the following afternoon, the top of a sealed staircase had been exposed, leading to a plastered doorway bearing the seal of the royal necropolis. Carter had his patron cabled from Egypt. Wonderful discovery in valley, congratulations. When Carnarvon arrived and Carter made a small breach in the inner sealed doorway and held the candle through the hole, what he saw was objects everywhere, glinting in the candlelight where they had sat untouched for over 3,000 years. When Carnarvon asked if he could see anything, Carter replied with the words that became one of the most famous sentences in archaeological history. Yes, wonderful things. The clearance of the tomb took 10 years of meticulous work, documenting and removing over 5,000 individual objects. The objects themselves. The golden death mask is what most people see when they think of Tutankhamun. It is a face of beaten gold, inlaid with lapis lazuli, carnelian, turquoise, obsidian, and glass, weighing 11 kilograms, designed to cover the face and shoulders of the royal mummy and serve as a spiritual container for the Ka, the life force, of the deceased king. It represents an idealized royal face, large eyes outlined in lapis, the Nemes headdress striped in gold and blue, the uraeus cobra and vulture heads at the brow representing the two lands of Upper and Lower Egypt. It is one of the most recognized objects in the world, and photographs cannot fully convey its impact. It radiates in person, something that goes beyond craft into the territory of the transcendent. But the mask was one object among 5,000. There were 4 gilded wooden shrines nested inside each other around the sarcophagus, the outermost nearly filling the burial chamber. Inside the shrines, a quartzite sarcophagus. Inside that, 3 nested coffins, the outermost and middle of gilded wood, the innermost of solid gold, weighing 110 kilograms. The combination of nested containers was designed to protect the royal mummy, while also providing multiple layers of symbolic and spiritual protection. The mummy itself was in poor condition, partially due to the ancient robbers who had disturbed it, and partially due to the excess of ritual oils and resins poured over the body at burial that had carbonized and stuck the mummy's wrappings to the coffin. Carter's team had to remove the mummy in sections. Analysis of the remains has been the subject of considerable scientific debate. Beyond the burial equipment were the treasury, the antechamber, and the annex, each room containing objects of extraordinary variety and quality. Gilded wooden model boats, alabaster vessels of sophisticated carving, board games, a golden fan still bearing remnants of ostrich feathers, military equipment, chariots, bows, arrows, shields, daggers, musical instruments, clothing, food offerings in sealed containers, canopic jars holding the mummy's preserved organs. Shabtis, small servant figurines meant to do agricultural work in the afterlife on the king's behalf, numbered 413 individual figures. Among the weapons, one dagger with an iron blade. Iron was extremely rare and precious in Egypt at this period, before the full development of iron metallurgy. Analysis published in 2016 confirmed that the iron in Tutankhamun's dagger was meteoric, literally fallen from the sky, shaped from a meteorite. A king buried with a blade of heavenly iron. How did he die? This is the question that has attracted the most forensic attention and generated the most competing theories, and the answer is still not fully settled. Physical analysis of the mummy identified fractures in the skull and other skeletal injuries, leading early investigators to propose murder. The theory of assassination was attractive narratively. The boy king, son of the heretic pharaoh, surrounded by powerful officials with their own agendas, dead at 18 under suspicious circumstances. Had I or Horemheb arranged his elimination to seize power? Subsequent analysis challenged the murder theory. The skull fractures appear in modern CT scanning to have occurred after death rather than during life, possibly as a result of post-mortem damage to the mummy. Other injuries, including a significantly fractured leg, appear to have been sustained shortly before death and were likely the result of an accident, possibly a fall from a chariot during hunting or military exercise. DNA analysis added another layer. Tutankhamun's remains showed evidence of multiple infections with the malaria parasite Plasmodium falciparum, suggesting he had suffered from malaria. His skeletal analysis also revealed bone abnormalities, including a clubfoot, a vascular necrosis of several bones, and other conditions consistent with the genetic consequences of royal family consanguinity. He possessed at least 130 walking sticks, more than any object category in his tomb, which may reflect not ceremonial symbolism but practical necessity. The current consensus, as much as there is one, suggests Tutankhamun died from a combination of underlying physical vulnerabilities rooted in inbreeding, a serious leg fracture that may have allowed infection to set in, and malaria. He was not necessarily murdered. He was simply, in the brutal biological arithmetic of the ancient world, unlucky. He died without a direct male heir, having had at least 2 daughters who both died before birth, their mummies found in the tomb. I became pharaoh briefly. Then Horemheb, the general who had been one of the most powerful figures throughout Tutankhamun's reign. Horemheb then carried out a systematic erasure of the Amarna period from Egyptian records, removing Akhenaten's names from monuments, reassigning his successors' monuments to himself, attempting to write the entire episode out of history. For a time, it nearly worked. Tutankhamun was so thoroughly erased from the official record that he was unknown to history until 1922. Which is why his tomb survived. The robbers who cleaned out so many royal tombs could not rob a pharaoh whose name had been expunged from memory and whose tomb's location had been buried under stone chips. His very erasure saved him. The curse. We cannot discuss Tutankhamun without acknowledging the curse of the pharaohs, which is one of the most successful pieces of popular mythology in modern history, and also almost entirely without factual foundation. Lord Carnarvon died in April 1923, 5 months after the tomb's opening, of blood poisoning following an infected mosquito bite that he accidentally reopened while shaving. He was 57 and in poor health already. Contemporary journalists, starved of dramatic copy now that the initial opening excitement had faded, seized on this death as evidence of an ancient curse. Reports embellished the story with invented elements: lights going out across Cairo at the moment of death, Carter's canary being eaten by a cobra, an inscription in the tomb warning of death to those who disturb the pharaoh's rest. None of these reports were accurate. No such inscription exists in the tomb. The lights out across Cairo story was a fabrication. The canary story was real but entirely coincidental, and the subsequent mortality rate among people present at the tomb's opening, when examined statistically, was completely consistent with expected mortality for a group of mostly middle-aged men in the 1920s. Howard Carter himself, who was closer to the tomb and its contents than anyone, lived until 1939, 16 years after the opening, dying at age 64 of lymphoma. What the curse story reveals is not ancient Egyptian necromancy, but early 20th century popular culture's appetite for exotic mystery, attached to anything emanating from Egypt. Egyptomania had seized the Western imagination since Napoleon's Egyptian campaign had brought scholarly documentation of the temples and monuments to European audiences, intensified with each subsequent archaeological discovery, and the Tutankhamun find was the biggest discovery ever. The press needed stories, readers wanted magic, and the death of Lord Carnarvon provided the peg on which a myth could be hung. The myth persists because it is a better story than the statistical reality, which is that the people who opened the tomb eventually died at normal rates from normal causes. But it should not be allowed to obscure the genuine wonder of what was actually found, which requires no supernatural embellishment because it is already astonishing. What does Tutankhamun mean? In the immediate practical sense, his tomb gave us the most complete snapshot of royal Egyptian material culture we possess. Without KV-62, we would know vastly less about what an Egyptian pharaoh wore, ate, played with, hunted with, rode in, sat on, slept on, and prayed to. The 5,000 objects in his tomb are a three-dimensional encyclopedia of New Kingdom court life. In the scholarly sense, the DNA and physical analysis of his mummy and of other mummies from his family has significantly advanced our understanding of royal Egyptian genealogy, the health consequences of dynastic inbreeding, and the specific medical conditions affecting individuals in the ancient world. In the cultural sense, Tutankhamun has become the face of ancient Egypt to the modern world, not because he was the most important pharaoh, but because he was the most completely preserved. The golden mask has appeared in contexts ranging from serious scholarship to pop music videos, from academic textbooks to fast food marketing. He has been on more postage stamps than any other ancient Egyptian. He has become the universal signifier of Egypt's ancient greatness. And in the deepest sense, the story of Tutankhamun is a story about time and chance and the strange mathematics of survival. A minor king, erased by his own successors, buried by accident under debris, forgotten for 3,000 years, found by a stubborn archaeologist who was given one more season. Had the debris not fallen in the right place, had Carter not been given that final season, had Davis been right that the valley was exhausted, the golden mask would still be underground. The things we know about the ancient world are the things that survived, and survival was never a function of importance. It was a function of chance. Tutankhamun reminds us that the past is full of gold still buried, of voices still unheard, of faces still covered in darkness. And occasionally, if the angle of debris and the stubbornness of one man align just right, the darkness gives way to candlelight, and something wonderful comes through. Part 4. The Olmec Civilization at the Dawn of the Americas. There is a stone head in the jungle of coastal Mexico that stares at you with a tranquility entirely disproportionate to the mystery it represents. It is enormous, taller than a person, carved from a single block of basalt, transported from a quarry dozens of kilometers away across river and swamp and tropical forest without wheeled vehicles or draft animals, worked by craftsmen using only stone tools. The face is African in appearance to many modern observers, though what that observation means about ancient transoceanic contact is, to put it diplomatically, a question on which the archaeological consensus is not where popular books sometimes suggest it is. It is one of 17 confirmed colossal heads found across 4 sites in the tropical lowlands of Mexico's Gulf Coast: San Lorenzo, La Venta, Tres Zapotes, and Laguna de los Cerros. They are the most iconic product of the culture that created them, a culture that flourished from roughly 1500 BC to 400 BC, and that archaeologists call the Olmec. The Olmec are, in the terminology of archaeological classification, the first major complex civilization of Mesoamerica, which means, if you translate that into plain language, they appear to have been first. First at what? First at building monumental public architecture in Mesoamerica. First at developing a hierarchical social structure with evidence of specialized craft production and long-distance trade. First at a range of cultural and religious symbols and practices that would reappear in substantially every subsequent major Mesoamerican civilization, including the Zapotec, the Maya, the Teotihuacano, and ultimately the Aztec. Whether the Olmec were the literal cultural ancestor of these later civilizations, or simply the earliest example of a set of developmental trajectories that arose independently across the region, is a question that archaeologists and linguists continue to debate. But they were there first, and what they built in the swampy, hot, geologically challenging lowlands of Veracruz and Tabasco was genuinely extraordinary. The environment the Olmec chose, or found themselves in, was not an obvious place for civilization. The Gulf Coast lowlands of southern Veracruz are not easy country. The climate is hot and humid, averaging temperatures in the high 20s Celsius year-round, with a rainy season that produces flooding across the flat coastal plain. The Coatzacoalcos, Tonalá, and Papaloapan rivers drain the region, and in the pre-drainage era they spread across the plain seasonally, creating an environment of wetlands, oxbow lakes, and river levees that shifted constantly over time. This was also, however, an environment of exceptional agricultural potential. The river flooding deposited rich alluvial soils. The warm temperatures allowed multiple growing seasons of maize, the staple crop. The rivers and coastal lagoons teemed with fish, turtles, and other protein sources. The forests provided game. The combination of agricultural abundance and aquatic resources could support dense populations in specific areas, and it was on the higher ground of river levees and natural mounds that the Olmec built their centers. San Lorenzo, the earliest major Olmec site, sits on a plateau above the surrounding wetlands in the Coatzacoalcos drainage. Modern archaeological investigations, particularly the extensive work carried out by Ann Cyphers and her team since the 1990s, have revealed that the San Lorenzo Plateau was itself substantially artificial, built up deliberately with fill to create a raised platform approximately 1 kilometer by 700 meters, on which monumental architecture was constructed. The effort required to move this much fill using human labor without draft animals or wheeled vehicles is difficult to overstate. At San Lorenzo, the earliest colossal heads were created, somewhere between 1400 and 1200 BC. The basalt for the heads came from the Tuxtla Mountains, some 60 to 100 kilometers distant. Moving blocks of stone weighing up to 40 tons across this terrain, across rivers and through wetlands, required organization, labor, and planning at scales that imply something more than simple village society. It implies hierarchy, authority, the ability to direct the labor of many people over extended periods, and the ideological or political frameworks that made people willing or compelled to undertake this work. What were the colossal heads? The most widely accepted interpretation is that they are portraits of individual rulers. Each head is different in facial features and in the design of the helmet-like headgear each figure wears. The headgear designs appear repeatedly across different objects, suggesting they functioned as emblems identifying specific individuals, analogous in function to the cartouche system used in ancient Egypt to identify royal names. If so, the heads are monumental royal portraiture on a scale designed to be visible, impressive, and permanent, declarations of individual power expressed in stone that could not be moved or defaced easily. Some scholars have proposed that the helmets depict the headgear worn by ballgame players, connecting the colossal heads to the Mesoamerican rubber ball game that would later be documented across virtually every subsequent civilization in the region. The rubber ball game was not purely athletic. It had deep ritual and cosmological significance, potentially functioning as a reenactment of mythological narratives about the cycle of the cosmos, and in some periods the losers, or possibly the winners, were sacrificed. The Olmec homeland is the source region for the rubber trees from which the balls were made, which may itself be significant. Whether the heads represent ball game champions, sacrificed kings, deified rulers, or something else entirely, their creation and placement was clearly a major undertaking of political and symbolic significance. They were meant to be seen. They were meant to be felt. They stood as statements of power at the center of major ceremonial complexes. At La Venta, the major Olmec site that flourished after San Lorenzo's apparent decline around 900 BC, the architectural planning was more elaborate. La Venta's central feature is a large earthen mound, over 30 meters high, described sometimes as a pyramid, though its irregularity suggests it may have been designed to resemble a volcanic mountain, an important symbol in Mesoamerican cosmology as the source of rain and the dwelling of supernatural powers. This mound is flanked by plazas, platforms, and other structures arranged along a precise north-to-south axis that appears to have astronomical significance. Beneath La Venta's floors, archaeologists have found massive buried offerings of serpentine blocks, arranged in precise geometric patterns. Mosaic pavements made of serpentine depicting abstract designs potentially representing the face of a supernatural being, and large quantities of jade and other valuable materials deposited in caches. These offerings were buried immediately after their creation, apparently never meant to be seen again after placement. Their audience was not the living, but the supernatural powers beneath the earth, to whom the Olmec apparently felt it necessary to offer extraordinary quantities of valuable material. The Olmec artistic tradition produced, in addition to the colossal heads, a corpus of smaller objects that display some of the most technically accomplished carving in ancient Mesoamerica. Jade was the supreme prestige material of the Olmec world. It was harder than steel, available only from specific sources hundreds of kilometers from the Gulf Coast. Working it required laborious abrasion with quartz sand and water over long periods, and the resulting objects were carried across Mesoamerica in long-distance exchange networks that reveal the geographic reach of Olmec influence. The social importance of controlling jade and the craftsmen who worked it was probably one of the mechanisms through which Olmec elite authority was established and maintained. Olmec jade carving produced objects of considerable sophistication. Small figurines depicting were jaguars, hybrid beings combining human and feline features that appear to represent a specific supernatural entity central to Olmec cosmology. Celts, elongated trapezoidal objects that were likely worn as chest ornaments by high-status individuals and that bear carved imagery of supernatural beings. Masks, small jade faces that may have been attached to larger objects or worn as funerary coverings, ornaments of every type. The jaguar motif is perhaps the most distinctive element of Olmec art. These figures have the large, square, downturned mouths of felines, cleft heads, infantile facial features, and eyes that appear to be partially supernatural in rendering. They appear across an enormous range of Olmec objects, in stone and jade and ceramic, large and small, suggesting a centrality to Olmec religious belief that modern scholarship is still working to fully interpret. Some researchers have proposed that the jaguar represents a rain deity, the supernatural embodiment of the forces that bring life-giving water from the mountains. Others have suggested it represents a shamanic transformation being, a human figure in the process of transforming into jaguar form, reflecting beliefs about the ability of ritual specialists to take on animal form and access supernatural realms. Others have proposed it is a specific mythological personage whose narrative context has been lost. The debate continues because the Olmec left us no written texts that can be read, only images, objects, and the spatial arrangements of their sites. The question of Olmec writing. This is one of the most contentious areas in Mesoamerican archaeology. Several artifacts that appear to date to the Olmec period or its immediate aftermath display what some researchers have interpreted as early writing systems. The Cascadel block, discovered in 1999 and published in 2006, is a piece of serpentine bearing rows of incised signs in a non-random arrangement that many epigraphers, scholars of ancient writing systems, believe constitutes a genuine writing system. If so, it would be the earliest known writing in the Americas by several centuries. Not all scholars agree. The debate about whether the Cascadel block represents true writing, proto-writing, a notation system of some kind, or an elaborate non-linguistic decoration is ongoing. What it clearly shows is that the Olmec were using organized visual symbols in ways that suggest at minimum a systematic approach to recording or communicating information. Whether this represents an independent invention of writing, a developmental precursor to the later Mesoamerican scripts, or something else, remains open. The later Zapotec writing system, which dates to around 500 BC and appears in Monte Alban and other sites in the Oaxaca Valley, is generally considered the earliest firmly attested writing in Mesoamerica. The relationship between Zapotec writing and anything the Olmec may have been doing with symbols is unclear, but the timing suggests the possibility of influence or diffusion. Similarly, the Mesoamerican calendar system, one of the most sophisticated indigenous timekeeping systems developed anywhere in the ancient world, featuring a 260-day ritual calendar interlocked with a 365-day solar calendar in a 52-year cycle, appears in its earliest confirmed forms in the Zapotec and the early Maya, but its antecedents may reach back to the Olmec or pre-Olmec periods. The rubber ball game, the iconography of the feathered serpent deity, the practice of bloodletting as ritual communication with the supernatural, the construction of oriented ceremonial complexes on north-south axes, the use of jade as the supreme prestige material. All of these features appear in the Olmec world before they appear in the Maya, the Zapotec, or Teotihuacan. This is the basis for calling the Olmec the mother culture of Mesoamerica, the originating source from which all subsequent Mesoamerican civilizations derive their fundamental cultural character. The concept is debated. Some archaeologists prefer to think of the Olmec as the earliest expression of a set of patterns that emerged across the region through complex interactions, rather than as a singular point of cultural origin. The distinction is important theoretically, and considerably difficult to settle empirically given the evidence available. What is not seriously disputed is that the Olmec were there first, that they built things of extraordinary ambition and beauty, and that their successors knew it. What happened to the Olmec? San Lorenzo appears to have declined around 900 BC, its monuments deliberately defaced and buried, its population dispersing or relocating. The deliberate destruction of the colossal heads and other monuments at San Lorenzo is archaeologically clear. They were broken, modified, and buried in specific arrangements that suggest deliberate ritual treatment rather than enemy attack. Whether this represents a revolution against an oppressive ruling class, a ritual renewal cycle that involved the symbolic death of the old order, environmental pressures that disrupted the agricultural base, or something else entirely, remains uncertain. La Venta flourished for several centuries after San Lorenzo's decline, reaching its peak somewhere between 800 and 400 BC, before it too was abandoned. The terminal phase at La Venta shows similar evidence of deliberate monument destruction and burial. The Olmec did not simply disappear. Their population continued in the Gulf Coast region, identifiable archaeologically through material culture sequences. What ended was the specific pattern of monumental construction, large-scale political authority, and long-distance exchange that characterized the major Olmec centers at their height. Whether this represents the collapse of a specific political system, environmental change, population movement, or the natural evolution of a culture into something new, is a question that the archaeological record cannot yet fully answer. What is clear is that the patterns they established did not end with them. The ballgame continued, the calendar continued, the jade continued. The word jaguar found new names and new contexts in new civilizations. The north-south axis orientation of ceremonial complexes continued at Teotihuacan, at Monte Alban, at Chichen Itza, at Caligula. The Olmec ended, their influence didn't. The colossal heads stand in museum gardens now, in Villahermosa and Jalapa and Jalapa, under glass or in the open air, and people walk past them and take photographs and move on. They are on tourist itineraries, on the covers of books, in airport gift shops as small painted ceramic replicas. But stand in front of one for a moment without the photograph in mind. Stand in front of the face of someone who lived 3,000 years ago, whose name we do not know, whose language we cannot speak, whose specific beliefs we cannot reconstruct, but who looked out at his world with an authority that his people saw fit to memorialize in 40 tons of basalt, transported across 60 kilometers of tropical terrain at the cost of years of collective labor. He was real. He had a name, even if we have lost it. He made decisions that people obeyed. He lived in a specific house, ate specific food, wore specific clothing, worried about specific things. He was a human being in full, in a civilization of full human beings, navigating the complexity of organized life with whatever tools they had. And then 3,000 years passed, and the jungle grew over everything, and the ground covered the stone, and the memory faded into silence. And then someone with a machete was clearing land in Veracruz in 1858, and a head emerged from the earth and stared at him, and we have been staring back ever since. That is the gift the past gives us if we are willing to look. Not answers exactly, but faces, evidence of presence. The confirmation that the world was full of people before us, complicated people, ambitious people, people who built things too heavy to move and carved faces too large to ignore, who are gone now but were absolutely, undeniably, irreducibly here. Part 5. The Plague When Death Walked the Earth. Here is how it began. A flea, a rat, a ship, a harbor in Sicily, probably Messina, in October 1347. A dozen Genoese trading vessels arriving from the ports of the Black Sea, crews already dying, already bearing the swellings at groin and armpit and neck that gave the disease its common name. Authorities at Messina ordered the ships out of the harbor immediately. The ships left. The rats carrying their infected fleas had already disembarked. Within 3 years, somewhere between a third and half of the population of Europe was dead. The Black Death, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, is the most lethal pandemic in recorded human history by proportion of affected population, and one of the most transformative events in the development of the modern world. It killed so many people so quickly that the survivors found themselves in a world that had been reorganized by sheer absence. And that reorganization, painful and catastrophic as it was, eventually helped reshape the relationship between lords and peasants, changed the economics of labor, altered the trajectory of medicine, theology, and art, and left marks on European culture that are still legible today. This is the story of a century and a half of plague, the world it destroyed, and the world it inadvertently helped create. What did the plague look like? What did it feel like to live in a city in 1348 as the disease arrived? The chronicles of the period are among the most harrowing documents in human literature. Giovanni Boccaccio, the Italian writer who survived the plague in Florence and set his Decameron in its shadow, described what happened in the city with a clinical precision that has the quality of trauma. He wrote of the swellings that appeared in the groin and armpit, swellings that could grow to the size of an apple, and the black and purple spots that appeared on arms and thighs and elsewhere on the body, signs that death was close. He wrote of the speed of death, people going to bed healthy and dying before morning, and of the social dissolution that followed, people abandoning their sick relatives, fleeing the city, barricading themselves in houses with food and wine and refusing to admit anyone. The medical understanding of the time was entirely inadequate. Physicians, working within the Galenic framework of humoral medicine, explained the plague as caused by miasma, corrupt or poisonous air produced by rotting matter, astrological configurations, or the wrath of God. Treatment options were correspondingly unhelpful. Bloodletting, lancing the swellings, applying poultices of various materials to the skin, or flight. Flight was actually the most effective medical advice available, since removing yourself from a plague-stricken area before you were infected was the single most reliable way to survive, but flight required resources and freedom that most people did not have. The plague moved in two forms that were sometimes simultaneous. Bubonic plague, transmitted primarily by flea bite, produced the characteristic swellings, the buboes, at the lymph nodes of groin, armpit, and neck. It was lethal in perhaps 60 to 70% of untreated cases. Pneumonic plague, transmitted by respiratory droplets when plague had spread to the lungs, was lethal in nearly 100% of cases without modern treatment and moved faster through populations. Septicemic plague, spread through direct contact with infected blood, was also nearly universally fatal. The Black Death probably involved all three forms operating simultaneously in affected populations. The fleas that transmitted bubonic plague primarily lived on the black rat, Rattus rattus, which was the dominant urban rat of medieval Europe. Rats lived wherever humans stored food, which was virtually everywhere in medieval cities, in granaries, in ships' holds, in the thatched roofs of houses, in the stone walls of buildings. When a rat died of plague, its infected fleas needed a new host and transferred to humans. The density and close quarters of medieval urban life, the lack of any understanding of the transmission mechanism, and the absence of any effective treatment created conditions under which the disease spread with terrifying efficiency. Some estimates suggest it killed 25 million people in Europe in the first outbreak alone, from 1347 to 1351, representing roughly a third of Europe's population. Some regions were hit harder than others. Florence may have lost half or more of its population. Certain towns and rural areas were wiped out almost entirely. England is estimated to have lost between a third and a half of its people. The Mediterranean cities, dense and commercially connected, were hit early and hard. The speed was almost as traumatic as the scale. In a world without mass communication, a city might learn that plague was coming from the refugees fleeing ahead of it, and then within weeks be watching its own neighbors die. There was no time to develop social responses, no time to organize care systems, no effective treatment to offer. People died, and the living buried them as fast as they could and tried to survive the next day. The social responses to the plague ranged from the admirable to the catastrophic. Some communities maintained civic order and organized collective responses to burial and care of the sick. In Venice, the municipal government implemented quarantine, from the Venetian word for 40, a 40-day waiting period imposed on ships and travelers from affected areas before they could enter the city, one of the first public health measures in European history, and one whose logic, keeping potentially infected people isolated for the incubation period of disease, was sound even if the specific mechanism of disease transmission was not yet understood. Other communities descended into violence. The most horrific response to the plague was the persecution of Jewish communities, accused throughout Germany and France and the Low Countries of poisoning wells to cause the disease. These accusations were absurd on every level. Jewish people were dying of the plague at the same rate as everyone else, and the mechanism they were accused of exploiting didn't resemble how plague actually spread. But the need to explain catastrophe in human terms, to assign blame for something incomprehensible, was powerful enough that dozens of Jewish communities were massacred, their residents burned alive in their homes or forcibly expelled. The Pope issued a bull formally condemning the persecutions and noting that Jewish people were dying at the same rate as Christians, which was true but less persuasive to the murderers than the Pope apparently hoped. The flagellant movement emerged as another response. Groups of men, sometimes hundreds strong, moved through towns publicly flogging themselves with leather straps embedded with metal tips, performing ritualized self-inflicted suffering as a form of collective penance intended to appease God's wrath. The flagellants were initially tolerated and sometimes welcomed by the populations they moved through, who were desperately seeking any action that might interrupt the catastrophe. They were eventually condemned by the Pope, partly because some flagellant groups were developing theologically heterodox views about the efficacy of priestly mediation, partly because large groups of mobile people during a pandemic was a predictable vector for spreading disease further. The plague also revealed and intensified existing social tensions. The relationship between peasants and the lords who owned the land they farmed had been in increasing strain across the 13th and early 14th century, as population growth pushed more people onto marginal agricultural land and depressed rural wages. The plague, by killing so many people so quickly, inverted the labor market overnight. Where there had been too many peasants competing for too little work, suddenly there were too many fields and too few hands to work them. Surviving peasants found themselves in possession of unprecedented bargaining power. Move somewhere else, work for the lord who offers better terms, demand the abolition of feudal service obligations. Lords, unsurprisingly, resisted this. In England, the Statute of Labourers of 1351 attempted to fix wages at pre-plague levels and compel peasants to work for any lord who demanded it at the old rates. It was largely ineffective because economic reality was more powerful than legislation. Wages rose. Service obligations became harder to enforce. The feudal system that had organized English rural society for nearly 300 years began, slowly and unevenly, to erode. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 in England, which produced one of the most remarkable confrontations in medieval English history, with peasants marching on London, burning the Savoy Palace, and briefly occupying the Tower, was not directly caused by the Black Death, but was part of the long chain of social tension it had set in motion. The plague did not come once and leave, it came back. This is crucial to understanding the 14th and 15th centuries. The Black Death of 1347 to 1351 was the first and most lethal visitation, but Yersinia pestis had established itself as an endemic presence in European rodent populations and would return repeatedly for the next 3.5 centuries. Major outbreaks struck in 1361, 1369, 1374, and 1390, and then on a roughly decadal cycle for the next 100 years. The plague of 1361 was particularly severe, hitting children and younger adults especially hard because the generation that had survived 1347 through 1351 had partial acquired immunity, while the people born after had none. Living in Europe between roughly 1350 and 1500 meant living with the knowledge that the plague could return at any time, with no warning, no treatment, and no reliable way to avoid it. This knowledge saturated the culture. The dance of death, the danse macabre, became one of the central artistic and literary themes of the late Middle Ages. Personified death-leading figures from every level of society in an unavoidable procession, pope and emperor, merchant and peasant, all reduced to equal participants in the final dance. The image was painted on church walls, printed in books, performed in dramatic productions. It was the period's way of processing collective experience of mortality at a scale that no previous generation had faced. The plague also shaped medicine, not by generating correct answers, but by demonstrating so comprehensively that existing answers were wrong. When your entire therapeutic tradition produces treatments that do nothing against a disease, killing a third of the people around you, the inadequacy is visible in a way that is harder to rationalize than when medicine fails one patient at a time. The medieval medical establishment didn't immediately embrace new ideas because it didn't have new ideas to embrace. Germ theory was still 3 centuries away. But the plague created a pressure toward observation and empiricism that eventually contributed to the medical developments of the Renaissance and early modern period. How does a society survive something like this? How do people keep living, keep working, keep building, keep making things, when death is that close and that random and that total? They do it imperfectly. They do it with grief and anger and denial, and occasionally with extraordinary courage. They do it because the alternative is to stop, and stopping is not something humans are well designed for. The remarkable thing about the 14th century, in retrospect, is not the devastation, as real as that was. It is the survival. Cities that lost half their populations were rebuilt. Agricultural systems that had collapsed from lack of labor found new equilibriums. Art continued to be made, sometimes art of extraordinary power and beauty that could not have been made without the shadow of the plague behind it. The Decameron, which Boccaccio wrote in the plague's immediate aftermath, is one of the foundational texts of European literature. Its frame story, a group of young Florentines fleeing the plague by retreating to the countryside and entertaining each other with stories, uses catastrophe as the backdrop for an exploration of human love, greed, intelligence, foolishness, desire, and above all resilience that feels written by someone who has seen the absolute worst and chosen to respond by celebrating the living. The theological disruption of the plague was real and lasting. If God had permitted this, what did that say about God? If prayer had not stopped it, what did that say about prayer? If priests died at the same rate as sinners, what did that say about priestly authority? These questions did not produce immediate answers, but they contributed to a climate of religious questioning that fed into the movements of the 14th and 15th centuries that would eventually produce the Reformation. Martin Luther, nailing his theses to a church door in 1517, was operating in a world that the plague had partially built, a world where the authority of the church had been tested against catastrophe and found humanly fragile, where questions about the relationship between human beings and God that had previously been answered by institutional authority were now alive in a new way. The last major outbreak in Western Europe was the Great Plague of London, 1665, which killed roughly 100,000 people in the city, somewhere between 1/4 and 1/5 of London's population at the time, in a single year. Samuel Pepys, the diarist, recorded its progress through London with the mixture of horror and morbid fascination that great disasters tend to produce in observers lucky enough to be watching rather than dying. He described seeing houses with red crosses painted on their doors, the mark of infected households quarantined inside. He described the death carts, the bells, the emptying of the streets. He also described going to the theater and worrying about his finances and pursuing his complicated romantic life, because even in a plague year people are still full humans with full human preoccupations. The Great Fire of London, which swept through the city the following year in September 1666, is traditionally credited with ending the London plague, the fire supposedly destroying the rat-infested buildings where plague had sheltered. This is a satisfying narrative, but probably not the complete explanation. Plague had been declining before the fire. The specific combination of conditions that had allowed it to persist in London was changing anyway. Yersinia pestis persists in the world today. It exists in rodent populations in Central Asia, in parts of the American West, in Africa. Modern cases occur every year, primarily in Madagascar, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and Peru. It is treatable with antibiotics when caught quickly. It is no longer the automatic death sentence it was in 1347. But it is still there. The bacterium that killed a third of medieval Europe is still in the world, still in the fleas, still in the rats, still waiting. We have medicine now that can stop it, and systems for tracking it, and the theoretical knowledge of germ theory that tells us what it is and how it moves. The people of 1347 had none of those things. They had only each other, and their prayers, and the stubborn human refusal to give up even in the face of something that seemed designed to finish them. They survived. We are the evidence. What the dark teaches us. It is late now. You have spent tonight in ancient Rome, picking your way across stepping stones above the flowing gutter of a street that smells of 1,000,000 lives pressed together. You have followed Napoleon from a cold military school in Brienne to the frozen catastrophe of the Russian winter. You have stood in the candlelight of Howard Carter's original Astonishment as the glint of gold came through the darkness of a sealed doorway in the Valley of the Kings. You have looked up at stone faces in the Mexican jungle that stare back at you across 3,000 years. You have watched the red crosses appear on the doors of London houses, and heard the cartwheels on the cobblestones, and understood something about what it means to live in a world without any guarantee of tomorrow. This is what history actually is. Not the clean narrative of inevitable progress that textbooks sometimes suggest. Not the parade of great men that older histories preferred. Not the simple clash of civilizations that oversimplified narratives offer. History is this: people. People in specific circumstances, making decisions with the information they had, shaped by forces they only partially understood, trying to build something meaningful out of the materials available to them. The Romans built aqueducts and amphitheaters and a legal system that still governs 3 continents, and they also built an economy dependent on enslaved people and died of infected mosquito bites because they didn't understand germ theory. Both things are true simultaneously, and neither cancels the other out. Napoleon wrote laws that are still in force and fought wars that killed millions, and transformed a continent's political geography, and died on a rock in the South Atlantic dictating his memoirs, simultaneously a visionary and a disaster, a liberator and a conqueror, a man too large for the categories available to judge him. Tutankhamun died at 18 from a combination of malaria and a broken leg and inbreeding and bad luck, and was erased from history by the people who came after him, and was hidden by chance under the debris of a later construction project, and was found 3,000 years later in the best-preserved royal tomb ever discovered, and now his face is on 1 billion photographs, and his name is known to every schoolchild on Earth. The historical record is not fair. Survival is not a measure of importance. We see what survived. The Olmec built heads too heavy to move and buried offerings no one would ever see, and created the template for civilizations that would flourish for 2,000 years after they were gone, and we don't know their name for themselves. We don't know the name of the person on those stone faces. We don't know what language they spoke, or what their origin stories said about the creation of the world. The silence where their voices should be is not an absence of history. It is history telling us something about itself, that it is incomplete, that it has always been incomplete, that what we know is a fraction of what happened. And the plague swept through a world that had no defenses and no understanding and almost no choices, and killed a third of everyone and left the survivors in a changed world. And those survivors kept living, kept planting, kept trading, kept arguing about theology and politics, and who owed what to whom, kept making art that we still look at, kept building institutions that we still inhabit, kept being human in the fullest and most complicated sense. That is what history is, the record of human beings being fully human in circumstances that made it difficult. And the reason to look at it, to sit with it in the dark and let the darkness speak, is not morbid curiosity, though that is part of it. It is something else. It is the discovery that the world was always complicated, that the present is not uniquely hard, that people before us survived things we can barely imagine surviving, that the human project is older and deeper and more resilient than any single catastrophe. Tonight, when you close this video and stretch out in your clean bed in your heated room with your access to clean water and modern medicine, and the accumulated knowledge of a civilization that has been building for thousands of years, somewhere underneath the floor of where you're sleeping are the bones of people who didn't have any of those things and built it anyway. You are the result of everything that survived, everything that endured, every person who woke up in a cold medieval hut and got up anyway, every legionary who kept marching, every plague survivor who kept planting, every archaeologist who kept digging, every civilization that kept building even when the jungle was coming back over the edges. You are the wonderful thing. Sleep well.